This Google form is to act as an introduction to slavery. I usually use this on the first day. Keep in mind, you might want to use all trigger warnings, make adjustments to this Google form to suit your needs, and to also keep in mind that students may not want to answer all of these questions, but it's usually used to act as a discussion because it references issues that will come up later on in the slavery unit. Since this is an introduction section, I usually ask students if they think slavery was about race, politics, or economics. Usually they will always go with race, disregarding politics and economics. The question why is then used, and these are then used for discussion based on student responses. If students feel uncomfortable answering any questions, they are allowed not to answer the questions. So I'm just going to give you my thought process for this particular form. We're going to first start out with the Native American tribes, and I'm trying to get students to think about the Native American tribes that were there, as well as the African empires that existed that are eventually going to play some sort of role in the transatlantic slave trade. This image here comes from the AP African American Studies framework, and you will see some of those images in here. So if you teach that particular class, this could also be useful. We're going to first start out with this particular image. I'm trying to get students to think about the labor force needed to develop what is eventually going to become the United States. Looking at this image here, and then factoring in the labor options that you have, where you have European workers, Native Americans, and then all of the problems that arise with those particular issues. As we continue down, students are required to pick a labor force. I then use an indentured servant advertisement. The biggest problem with indentured servants is that these individuals are eventually going to be set free, so they are not a permanent labor force. Then we start looking at some of the new options, and the new options involve these various tribes. What I'm trying to do here is to get students to think about the coast, because African tribes conquered some of the other African tribes and then moved them from the interior to the coast, where they would then be sold as part of the triangle trade. So you have these options here, and this is the part that I was saying that possibly might be concerning or problematic. So you definitely want to use caution with these questions. I usually stop the class and stress the point that this is not meant to be offensive in any way. It's just designed to understand the economic powerhouse that slavery was. And I'll probably say that a couple of times. When they pick the tribe, A, B, C, or D, then we get to the issue here. If they selected D, they are now sick and suffer death. What I'm trying to get to here is the involvement of African American tribes. I included this particular image again from the AP framework, trying to establish the triangle trade and the role of Africans as well as Europeans in this particular transatlantic slave trade. Hopefully this link continues to work. When you click this link, it uses these dots to indicate the amount of people that are leaving. I believe it starts in the 1400s, and it takes you all the way up into the Civil War of how many people are leaving Africa for Central and North and South America. As I mentioned before, the triangle trade, the Middle Passage, we're getting ready to start looking at some of those, that journey. Here I used another source that's trying to address what is actually going on with regard to the transportation of slaves. Did Africans play a role in slavery? The answer here is yes. Students are usually amazed by that. I included the lyrics to this song by Public Enemy. Feel free to cut that out if you feel that this is not an issue that you want to address. The reason why I included it here is because they're saying here, King in Chief probably had a big beef, which is a reference to the African involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. And the songwriter here is saying that they grit their teeth at that because they're kind of upset about that particular issue. We then start to look at some of the new options. And the new options, now we have some additional images. Again, some of these are from the AP framework. And this image here, usually students struggle with. And then I'll make comments about, if I'm a slave entrepreneur, eventually I have to come to the decision that I need to make some sort of device. And that device, let's just say I need to patent it. that means that I'm going to have to register this device with the government. And then it gets to the point about government involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. Some more images from the AP framework, the themes from the AP framework, and then we're starting to look at the middle passage. Now, I do realize that this is the same ship with the layers, but I'm using the top image as one example of loose packing and the bottom one as tight packing. I get it that there is a cross section of the ship, and maybe we're just looking at we're looking at multiple levels here. But now students are being forced to be put in this position as a transporter of slaves. And as I said before, not everybody's going to feel comfortable about this. But again, that seems to be the point, that they're not looking at these individuals as human beings. They're looking at them purely as cargo. So when they're being asked how many are they going to take over the Atlantic, they definitely want to factor this in, because the more you take, the less that are going to be, alive when you make it to your final destination. I know that's, probably problematic to think about addressing, but the reality is that, this is slavery, and slavery was a brutal institution. These images were from a museum in DC. It's no longer there. I'm hoping that they place this in the African American History Museum. Some more images of the slave trade or the slave ship. More images from the AP framework. And this is just used to, give some visuals to the students so they have a visual understanding for what this process is actually like. We then have a primary source document about an account from a slave. We then have this manifest looking at the amount of individuals who are not making it. As we see here, died, and then the log number for the actual human being. Some more images that go along with the AP framework. Permanent involuntary hereditary servitude. Now starting to look at the issue of the transition with the slave codes, and the slave codes that were used to slowly erode the free status of the first Africans to be here. So that's what this section here. And the goal is to get to permanent involuntary hereditary servitude, which is going to create a situation where the slaves are permanently going to be locked into servitude. We then transition to America, some slave ads, and a store that's selling, having an auction. And again, I always point out that if you are building a ship, that ship has to be registered with the government. And if you have a store, that store is going to have to be registered as well with the government. And there's a lot of hands invested in this particular institution. And when students complete this form, they really leave with an understanding of the brutality of slavery and possibly why it's going to be difficult to get rid of. Slave breaking. We then transition to slave breaking. Sometimes I show the image from the scene from Roots. This image right here I wind up getting from a Civil War book, and sadly it is an image of a slave breaking service that is coming down to beat the slaves that are here. And again, if your business involves that process, that really goes to show the lengths of slavery and how many institutions and businesses and side businesses are attached to this institution. Here we have the link that will take you to the Toby slave breaking scene. We then transition to something called the dozens. The dozens apparently was the purchase of slaves at a discount. As you can see in these images, I tried to use stick figures. This individual has no arms. This individual is missing one arm. This individual has no legs. And when you buy these slaves at a cheaper price, you're just looking at these options. And again, I know that this is possibly problematic and not everybody might feel comfortable about this, but this is the reality. I mean, if you're going to buy a 40-year-old female slave versus an 8-year-old female slave, someone muscular versus the dozens, these seem to be the options I included a source there. 50 years later, female slaves are in demand. Now I'm trying to look at the fact that you can, with permanent involuntary hereditary servitude, you can breed your female slave, and that's going to lead to a situation where those slaves are costing more money. Then once again, we're back to how many people you're going to take. Some more questions about the female aspect of it. Then we get into the cotton gin. I provided some data for the amount of cotton in pounds that's being produced. And now we have another question here involving math, where you need to figure out how you're going to meet your production quotas. Then we get to the final conclusion section. And in this particular section, try to get students to think about their reaction to this form. But mainly the goal here is to have an understanding about the role of economics, and that the economics is going to create a situation where there's just too many hands, too much money being made off slavery, which is part of the reason why it's going to exist for so long. We then transition to the politics of slavery. Now this goes hand in hand with the economics. This one I usually complete a couple days after the other. And for this one, we look at these particular terms that are here. Notice the terms start off with the starting of America, slavery going into the 1800s. Then we kind of transition into the mid to late 1800s. Then we transition to the civil rights. And what I'm trying to get students to understand is that there is the local and state government, and they're always at some sort of competition or tension with the federal government. And that kind of is going to lead to a series of compromises, like the Compromise of 1876. And the federal government repeatedly, from the view of the anti-federalists or the 1800 Democrats, are constantly trying to force legislation down the states, which is going to lead to the issue of states' rights. This follows the same process. Same question: is slavery about, was it about race, economics, or politics? The focus here is to get students to think about the role of politics. That is the main focus for this one. And then it might be a repeat of some earlier information. For example, the legislative branch of government, they're the ones who can pass the law. But then we look at this section of the Constitution, which is saying this is actually a power denied to Congress up until this particular year of year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed. So this is really looking at the political aspect of it. And then I tried to use some simple math, where for using this scenario here, for every 100 people you have, you can send one person to the federal government to represent you. So if we look at here, we got 4, 10, 8, 6. And then when we do this for the South, we come up with the amount of people they have, the amount of total votes, northern votes, southern votes. But then we throw in this scenario here, where whether or not the southern states should be allowed to count their slave population, because when you factor this into the situation, their slave population, they really do not have too many free people in these states, which means they should actually have 4. But the question here is, are they allowed to count their slave population, which is going to get us into the 3/5 compromise. So it's really designed to use this math to try to get students to understand how this is ultimately going to lead to a stalemate and eventually the Civil War. This scenario here is looking at the issue of taxes, and what's going on here is that the southern states do not want to count their slave population when it comes time to pay for taxes to the federal government. Students are quick to point out the inconsistency in their argument with this particular section. For the South, not counting the slaves was done when negative impact to the cause. And my point is that the issue of slavery was never clearly resolved. And I think when we get into this compromise of the 3/5 compromise, that really gets to that particular point that I'm trying to make. But again, it's about the students doing the math and recognizing that the legislative branch and sometimes the judicial branches, as well as the executive branch, are playing some sort of direct or indirect role, depending on how you want to look at it. Then we start looking at additional states. And at this point, if students did the math correctly, they should pretty much be at a stalemate. And each new territory that's going to be developed into a state is going to throw off the balance. I'm going to be making up some numbers here. If we're talking about 16 in the north and 15 in the south, if we're going to throw these states into the equation and they all come in as free states, let's say we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's just say each one has 10. Then that's going to create a situation where we have 26 instead of 15. And then you could probably pass a law that ends slavery. But this is going to create an additional situation where there's more of a stalemate. And in this image here, trying to get to that point that for each new state that you add, the question is going to come back right back to the issue of, are they coming in as a free state or a slave state? What could Congress do regarding the new state admission? They could nothing due to the political stalemate. Then we get into the Northwest Ordinance. We get into the Missouri Compromise line. And at this point, students start to get a little frustrated about what's actually going on, because they start to recognize that when you look at the politics of it, that the country seems to be deadlocked on this issue of slavery for many years. We move on to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Same question: is slavery allowed in the free state? Is it allowed in slave states? Who determines if the state will be free or not? And then it's about the people moving there, because again, this is the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is eventually going to lead to Bleeding Kansas. I have an image from Bleeding Kansas. Then we move on the issue of runaway slaves, Fugitive Slave Act. At this point, students are definitely understanding that the federal government, on so many issues, has given in to the demands of the South, whether because they want to or they can't because of the deadlock. But then on the issue of this situation, students are quick to point out, well, wait a minute, why is the federal government able to pass this piece of legislation here that's going to help? If they can do this, why can't they end slavery? And again, that's going back to the point of what this forum is designed to get students thinking about. Start looking a little bit about political parties, and then we come to the end. Now, this is a section that maybe you want to think about here. Is looking at institutional racism, the murder of Latasha Harlins, which happened in the 90s. And what I'm trying to establish here is that on so many occasions, African Americans have been on the short end of the stick as a result of some of these cases, whether we're talking about OJ, Latasha Harlins, that the history shows that there is a governmental, whether it's government or the judicial system, that on so many situations that it really just didn't go in the favor of African Americans when they were free or when they were slave. And this form is designed to really get students to think about it. When you combine it with the economics of slavery, students do have a understanding of some of the complicated issues involving slavery, why it lasted so long. The economics and the politics just led to that stalemate.